A metallic knock echoed through my doorway, and when I opened it, the maintenance officer stood there with an uneasy look on his face. He rubbed the back of his neck like he wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say. Then he told me the line that froze the room around us. "Your daughter-in-law said you don't need hot water tonight." The words landed with a dull weight, simple and blunt, but sharp enough to cut through the evening quiet. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, small but real, like a warning settling into place. He stepped inside, lowering his voice as if the walls could listen. He said it didn't sit right with him. Hot water restrictions weren't standard, not for anyone, and definitely not for someone my age. He explained it the way someone explains a rule they've seen broken, flat, factual, with a hint of discomfort. I stood there listening, feeling the edges of his concern press against my own growing confusion. His tone was steady, but the worry behind it wasn't subtle. I told him my name and my age, keeping my voice calm even as something inside me tightened. 71 isn't old enough to lose understanding, but it's old enough to know when something feels off. I could hear my breath shift as I processed the sentence again. Someone in this house, a person I lived with, trusted by default, had given an instruction about my comfort, like it was optional. There was nothing dramatic in the officer's face, just that firm line people have when they're trying to respect a boundary and do their job at the same time. When he left, I walked back toward the bathroom and turned the tap out of pure instinct. The water came out cold, almost painfully so, like it had been waiting there to prove the point. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that chill in the evenings. A few nights earlier, the water had cooled halfway through my shower, forcing me to finish quickly with tight shoulders and shallow breaths. I'd blame the pipes, the weather, the old bones in this house. Now those excuses felt thin, almost naive. I stood still for a moment, letting the cold air wrap around my arms. Small discomforts I'd pushed aside began lining up in my mind. The sudden chill on certain nights, the slow warm-up that never fully came back. The way my daughter-in-law had told me once, with a tight smile, that I shouldn't be showering so late at my age. At the time, I'd brushed it off as casual talk. Tonight, it didn't sound casual anymore. A faint tremor ran through me, not panic, but something sharper, quieter. It was the realization that this wasn't malfunction or timing or coincidence. This was someone making a decision on my behalf, without my knowledge, about something as basic as heat and comfort. I felt the truth settle slowly, heavy and unwelcome. It wasn't the cold water that bothered me most. It was the thought that someone under my own roof had chosen it for me. I turned off the tap and stared at the still surface of the sink. There was no noise in the house, no footsteps or voices, just the quiet hum of the heater working for everyone, except me. That silence told me more than any argument or excuse could. Something inside this home had shifted, and I could feel the threat of it touch the back of my neck like a draft coming from a door I wasn't supposed to notice. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting the quiet press against me in a way it hadn't before. The house wasn't unfamiliar, but it didn't feel like mine either. I'd moved in 2 months earlier, right after the surgery on my hip. The doctor didn't want me alone while I recovered, and my son insisted it was easier this way. I agreed because it seemed practical, not because I wanted to depend on anyone. Losing my wife 3 years ago had already taught me how to live with empty rooms and quiet meals, but this kind of dependence felt different, closer, heavier, and less predictable. My daughter-in-law tried to greet me with polite smiles when I arrived, but her eyes stayed distant, measuring. Her tone always carried a clipped edge, as if every sentence cost her something. She wasn't rude, not exactly, but she was careful in the way someone is careful when handling something fragile they didn't ask for. She made decisions quickly and expected them to be accepted just as quickly. I told myself she was overwhelmed with work and the kids. I wanted to believe that. But even on quiet days, her presence in the hallway felt like a door half shut. Small things had happened in the weeks leading up to tonight, tiny shifts I noticed and then ignored. One evening, I reached for the thermostat and found it locked behind a new digital code. She told me it was to keep the kids from touching it, though they'd never shown interest in it before. Another night, the blanket I kept folded on the chair disappeared, and when I asked her about it, she said it needed washing. It didn't come back for 6 days. The kettle on the counter was usually full, but the moment I started using it more often, it was always empty with the lid left open. None of these things were dramatic. They weren't loud. They were the kind of details you dismiss when you don't want to make trouble in someone else's home. I kept telling myself that recovery made me hypersensitive, that age had a way of making ordinary moments feel complicated. I blamed my uncertainty on the slow ache in my hip, on the weakness that followed me around those first few weeks. It was easier to blame myself than to imagine someone else might actually be watching the clock on my comfort. But after what the maintenance officer said, those small incidents lined up in a way I couldn't ignore. His voice replayed in my mind every time I tried to settle back into routine. He doesn't need hot water tonight. That wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't oversight. It was permission, spoken softly, passed along casually, but permission all the same. I felt the truth of that settle deep in my chest, the weight of it turning heavy and cold. As I walked down the hall later that evening, I heard her in the kitchen, speaking to the kids with a smooth, sweet tone I'd never heard directed at me. When she turned and noticed me, her smile held for a moment too long before dropping back into its usual tight line. Her eyes flicked over me like I was clutter she had to work around. It was a small moment, but it landed with clarity. I wasn't a guest here. I wasn't family she welcomed. I had become something she tolerated, something that took space, time, and patience she didn't want to give. And for the first time since moving into this house, I realized the danger wasn't in the cold water. It was in the fact that someone under this roof wanted me uncomfortable enough to stop asking for anything at all. The next night, when I turned the shower handle, the same bitter cold rushed over my hand. It wasn't a slow fade or a partial warm-up. It was immediate, like someone had cut off the line entirely. I let the water run, hoping it would change, but it stayed frigid no matter how long I waited. The rest of the house felt warm enough. Steam drifted from under the kids' bathroom door down the hall. My daughter-in-law had just finished bathing them. Only my bathroom felt like a place meant to unsettle rather than comfort. When I stepped into the hallway, she appeared at the corner, folding a towel with tight, rushed movements. I mentioned the water wasn't heating again. She didn't even pause. "Pipes act up," she said, her voice flat. "Old houses do that." I told her it seemed odd it was only in my bathroom. She shrugged, eyes already moving past me. "You shower too long. It resets. Just give it time." There was no concern in her tone, no thought behind the excuse, just enough words to close the conversation. She walked away before I could respond. The next morning, I checked the water heater in the small service closet. I wasn't supposed to touch it, but I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The switch was off, completely off. I flipped it back on, making sure it was secure. That evening, after dinner, I checked it again, off, the same position. The timing was consistent. Late afternoon, into the night. Someone was doing this on purpose, and it wasn't an accident or a malfunction. It was a pattern. Later that night, I heard quiet voices drifting up from the living room. My son and his wife were arguing, but not loudly. Their words were fast and tense, like they were afraid of being overheard. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught small pieces. Not sustainable. Too much responsibility. We agreed. He needs less. Each fragment tightened something in my chest. My son sounded tired, worn out in a way I hadn't seen before. Her voice carried the same sharpness she used on me, only this time it had an edge of anger behind it. Over the next few days, other patterns began to show. Dinner plates reached me colder than they should have been, even when everyone else's food steamed. The heater in my room stayed dimmer than the rest of the house, a low hum instead of a full warmth. When I checked the panel, the setting had been lowered without explanation. My medication reminders, usually placed neatly on the dresser, started showing up late or not at all. Small details, quiet shifts, nothing you could call an emergency, but each one trimmed comfort in a way that felt intentional. I didn't confront anyone. I watched. I listened. I noted the timing. The changes weren't random. They followed a rhythm that centered on me, my routines, my needs, my moments of vulnerability. The house still held laughter and movement, but around me, the air felt colder, like someone was slowly pushing the boundaries of how uncomfortable they could make me without crossing a line that would draw attention. One thing became hard to deny. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't someone forgetting or slipping. This was someone choosing. Someone deciding what I did and did not deserve inside the same home where I slept under their roof. And the more I saw, the clearer it became that discomfort wasn't the mistake here. It was the goal. I woke before the rest of the house, the early hour giving me a kind of freedom I didn't have during the day. The quiet let me think clearly, and I needed that now. I went straight to the service closet and opened the water heater panel. A small digital log screen blinked in the corner. I hadn't noticed it, but when I scrolled through the history, the pattern appeared in plain numbers. Multiple manual shutoffs at almost the exact same times each evening. No warnings, no error codes. Just someone flipping the switch over and over, like they were managing a schedule. I stared at the times lined up on the screen, feeling the steady confirmation settle in. This wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone in this house had been controlling the heater with intention. The thought didn't shock me the way it might have a week ago. It just tightened a line inside my mind, something that told me I needed to move carefully from here on out. Later that morning, while everyone was rushing through breakfast routines, I passed the small command center my daughter-in-law kept on the kitchen counter. It was covered in mail, sticky notes, and a calendar. One sticky note near the corner caught my eye. My name shortened, written in her handwriting. Under it, a line read, Dad's hours. 2 numbers beside it, 4 to 9 p.m. Those were the exact times I usually showered, the same hours the heater had been shutting off. I kept my eyes neutral, my steps slow, and moved on before she noticed me looking. That afternoon, I checked the thermostat in my room. The display told me it was set several degrees lower than the rest of the house. When I tried to adjust it, a small lock icon appeared. The controls were restricted, yet in the hallway, one tap of a button changed the temperature immediately. Only my room carried that limitation. A quiet chill seeped into me, a deeper one than the cold air alone could bring. I started paying attention to smaller movements in the house. When a maintenance update came through our group chat, something about routine inspection for the vents, I saw her snatch the phone from the counter. She opened the message, paused, then hit delete. When my son asked later why the alert never came through, she brushed it off, saying the app must be glitching. I watched from the table, staying quiet, noting the tightness in her jaw as she spoke. Once, as I walked from the living room to the hallway, I felt eyes on me. I turned slightly and saw her standing by the kitchen entryway. She wasn't doing anything. No chores, no phone, no movement. She was just watching the way I walked, noticing the stiffness in my hip, studying me the way someone studies a problem they're trying to solve. When she realized I'd caught her, she shifted her expression into a quick, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. That night, I began collecting proof. Nothing dramatic, just quiet, steady documentation. I took photos of the thermostat lock, the heater logs, the sticky note. I wrote down dates and times on a notepad I kept hidden behind my dresser. I checked the heater twice a day and recorded every change. Each detail became a piece of a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. Not yet. I needed clarity. I needed certainty. And the longer I watched this house, the more it revealed things no one meant for me to see. I was heading down the hallway one afternoon when I heard her voice slip through the cracked kitchen door. It wasn't raised or angry, just steady, controlled, and far too certain. "He'll adjust," she said, like she was talking about the thermostat or a stubborn appliance. "He doesn't need all that comfort at his age." The words weren't meant for me, but they stopped me mid-step. There was no pity in her tone, no hesitation, just the kind of cold practicality that makes your stomach drop before your mind catches up. I stood still, letting the sentence settle in my bones. Later that same day, the babysitter arrived to help with the kids. I was at the dining table, reading quietly, when my daughter-in-law pulled the young woman aside. Her voice lowered, calm but directive. "If he asks for anything extra, long showers, heater turned up, don't change anything. We're saving energy and he'll be fine." The babysitter nodded, not questioning it. She didn't look cruel, just inexperienced, unaware of the weight behind those instructions. I kept my eyes on the page, but the words blurred. It was the first time I'd heard her direct someone else to limit my comfort, like it was a rule she was enforcing. That night, I checked the water heater again. The manual switch was off. When I tried to adjust the temperature, a digital keypad appeared on the screen. I hadn't seen that before. It required a password. I tried the house code. No luck. I tried a few common combinations. Nothing. On the 4th attempt, I paused and looked at the date on the kitchen calendar. Her birthday had been circled earlier for an upcoming dinner. I typed it in. The lock clicked open immediately. I stared at the display, my hand resting on the side of the unit. She hadn't secured the heater for safety. She'd secured it for control. The next morning, I overheard her talking to my son in the living room. The conversation was softer than their usual arguments, almost rehearsed. "The bills are going up," she said. "We're using more water, more heat. He needs more than we expected. It's becoming a strain." She positioned each sentence like she was laying bricks, building a structure he couldn't see over. My son sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "I just want everyone comfortable," he murmured. "It's temporary." She didn't argue, but her silence held the shape of disagreement. I stayed out of sight, letting the discussion drift away, but every word cut a little deeper. She wasn't just limiting my comfort behind closed doors. She was creating a reason for it, painting me as a burden, someone whose needs were excessive or unreasonable. The picture she drew wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, and dangerous because it sounded practical. It sounded believable. As I sat alone in my room that evening, the weight of everything pressed in at once. The shutoffs, the excuses, the restrictions, the way she measured her words around others and sharpened them when she spoke about me. It formed a pattern too clear to ignore. This wasn't frustration or misunderstanding. It was intention, stealthy, controlled, and growing bolder. A slow fear crept in, real and grounded. If she was comfortable taking away heat and comfort, what would be the next thing she decided I didn't need? Where would the line be for someone who'd already crossed several without hesitation? The danger wasn't in what she had done. It was in what she was preparing to do next. The maintenance officer returned 2 days later, stopping by under the excuse of routine checks, though the look in his eyes said he was here for something else. He waited until my daughter-in-law left for errands before stepping closer to me in the hallway. His voice dropped to a careful murmur. "Has anything improved since we talked?" The question wasn't casual. It carried a quiet tension, like he already suspected the answer. I told him the truth in simple pieces. Nothing had changed. The water was still cold at the same hours. The heater switch kept getting turned off. The thermostat in my room stayed locked. He listened, without interrupting, his expression tightening with each detail. When I mentioned the password-protected setting and how it matched her birthday, he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they've heard enough to confirm a suspicion they didn't want to be right about. He asked if he could check the system again, and I nodded. We walked to the service closet, and he opened the panel with a practiced, quiet efficiency. This time, he didn't just skim the surface. He navigated deeper into the digital logs, revealing sections I hadn't known existed: internal timestamps, authorization trails, manual override entries. "This isn't automatic," he said, pointing at the clustered entries. "Someone's turning it off through restricted access. Same window every night." His tone was flat, procedural, almost detached, but the gravity behind his words settled heavily in the small room. I leaned closer, reading the data myself. There was no way to misinterpret it. No glitch, no random error, no mechanical fault. The shutoffs were deliberate, hand-entered, timed, repeated. The access icon beside each entry wasn't general household use. It was registered to the admin account. When I asked him what that meant, he studied the screen for a moment before answering. "Only one person has that level of control," he said quietly. "Whoever set the password." He closed the panel gently, as if the house itself might react to the noise. His gaze stayed steady. "I need you to understand something," he said, choosing each word with care. "Shutting off hot water or heat to a senior resident, especially one recovering from surgery, is classified as neglect under our policy. Intentional neglect." He didn't add any drama to it. He didn't need to. The definition alone was enough to tighten the air around us. I felt a slow, cold realization settle through me. Not sharp, not shocking, just solid and undeniable. I had been documenting my suspicions, but this was different. This was proof written in time-coded entries, stronger than anything I could say out loud. It showed intent. It showed consistency. It showed a kind of quiet control that didn't need threats or shouting to do harm. The officer didn't tell me what to do. He didn't push for action or offer promises. He simply said, "Be careful," then added, "and keep your notes. They matter." His tone wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was grounded in the same procedural clarity that had guided all his explanations. When he left, I stood alone in the hallway with the hum of the heater vibrating faintly through the floorboards. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because I finally saw it for what it was. Someone had been making choices about my comfort, my health, my night-to-night life. Choices meant to shrink the space I occupied. This was the point where I could no longer pretend things would fix themselves. I needed to protect myself, even inside the walls where I was supposed to feel safe. I spent the next morning gathering everything I'd recorded. The heater logs, the thermostat photos, the sticky note with my name on it. I printed the digital timestamps the maintenance officer showed me and slipped them into a plain folder. Each piece felt heavier than paper should, but I kept my movement steady. I didn't want anyone in the house to notice I was assembling the truth. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about preparing myself for whatever came next, because silence was no longer something I could afford. By midday, my daughter-in-law's demeanor had shifted. She watched me with sharper eyes, tracking my movements through the rooms with attention she didn't bother hiding. When I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, she paused mid-swipe on her phone. Her gaze stayed fixed on me until I stepped out again. Something in her expression had changed. Less annoyance, more calculation. It was clear she sensed I wasn't drifting through the house blindly anymore. I was paying attention, and that alone made her uneasy. My son moved through the day, like someone caught in the middle of a storm he couldn't name. He asked if I needed anything twice, then stopped himself as if worried either answer might cause trouble. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the past week. I could see the weight he carried, tugged between a wife insisting on control and a father trying to remain respectful of someone else's home. When he looked at me, there was uncertainty in his eyes, the kind that comes when someone wants to do right but fears the fallout. That evening, I took the small steps I hoped I wouldn't need. I packed an overnight bag with just enough to leave quietly if the situation turned volatile. A spare set of clothes, my medication, the folder of evidence. I tucked the bag beneath the bed, hidden behind a storage bin. I placed my important documents, ID, medical papers, insurance, in a separate envelope near the dresser. When I slipped the extra set of house keys into my pocket, a faint chill ran through me. Not panic, just the sober understanding that I needed to think carefully, like someone preparing for a storm moving in. After dinner, the atmosphere sharpened. She snapped at me over something trivial, the way I stacked a plate on the counter. Her voice cut through the room, sharp and unrestrained. My son tried to soften her tone with a quiet word, but she brushed him off. Her hostility wasn't subtle anymore. It was the kind that comes from fear of losing control, the kind that cracks through a mask when pressure builds too quickly. For the first time since moving into the house, I saw a flicker of genuine anger in her eyes, directed solely at me. When the dishes were done and the house quieted, I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the weight of the moment settle in. Avoiding the truth had only given it more room to grow. The evidence in the folder was no longer just information. It was a mirror reflecting what this home had become. I couldn't wait for someone else to intervene. I couldn't pretend this was a misunderstanding. The danger wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was deliberate, patterned, and escalating. I breathed slowly, letting my thoughts settle into a firm, steady line. The confrontation wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only way to protect myself. The maintenance officer arrived the next afternoon for his scheduled inspection, the same routine check he'd mentioned earlier in the week. My daughter-in-law didn't expect him to come inside. She stood frozen for a moment when he stepped past the doorway with his clipboard. My son followed behind him, confused but polite, asking if something needed fixing. The officer kept his tone neutral, saying he just needed access to the service closet. It was the opening I'd been waiting for. I stepped into the living room and told them all we needed to talk. My daughter-in-law tried to brush it off immediately, saying she was busy and the kids needed her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told her this conversation wasn't optional. My son looked between us, uneasy, sensing the weight in the room. I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it. The first page held the printed logs of the water heater, every manual shut-off marked with date and time. "These entries aren't automatic," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Someone turned the heater off by hand." Repeatedly, she stiffened, the color draining slightly from her face. "Those logs glitch," she said quickly. "You're misunderstanding. That system messes up all the time." The officer stepped closer, flipping through the papers with a practiced eye. "These aren't glitches," he corrected quietly. "They're verified manual overrides, admin access only." My son's head snapped up at that, his eyes narrowing as he waited for her explanation. I slid the photo of the keypad lock across the table next. "I found the password protection 2 nights ago," I said. "Your birthday unlocks it." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She blinked fast, searching for footing. "I don't know how that happened," she said finally, her voice thin. "Maybe the system defaulted to it. Maybe he typed it wrong and forgot. He forgets things." My son looked at me, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted, like a cord pulling tight. She continued talking, piling excuses on top of each other, blaming the heater, the age of the house, the settings, my recovery, anything she could reach. None of it landed. The officer spoke before she could continue. "Ma'am, the entries show intentional shutdowns targeted to one fixture, not the whole house. That qualifies as neglect under policy." Targeted neglect. The word hung in the air with quiet finality, heavier than shouting could ever be. My son stepped back as if the floor had moved under him. "You told me the bills were up because Dad was using too much," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the hurt behind it was sharp. She tried to speak again, but the tension in the room swallowed her words. Her excuses started bumping into each other, losing shape as she reached for anything that could make this look like a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. I laid out the final pages, photos of the locked thermostat in my room, the sticky note with Dad's hours, the deleted maintenance alerts. The officer confirmed each point with a nod, his voice calm, objective, and unyielding. My daughter-in-law's breathing turned shallow, her calm slipping into something closer to panic. My son stared at the documents, his face tightening as the pieces assembled themselves into a truth he could no longer avoid. The clash that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her words came out fast, denials, blame, frustration, but none of it covered the evidence in front of us. My son asked her why. She couldn't give him an answer that made sense. The officer reminded them both of the seriousness of the situation. She looked at me once, a flash of fear in her eyes, then looked away quickly, as if the truth itself was too bright to face. The room felt still by the time the arguing quieted, but the damage was already done. There was no turning this back into excuses. Everything she tried to hide was now in plain view. The house sat in a heavy quiet the morning after the confrontation, a silence that didn't feel like peace, but like something shutting down. The maintenance officer returned early, not with a clipboard this time, but with a serious expression that left no room for doubt. He explained, in plain procedural terms, that he had already escalated the situation to his department. They were required to file a formal report with Adult Protective Services. There was no anger in his voice, no judgment, just the steady tone of someone following protocol because the facts demanded it. By noon, the documentation had been submitted. Every piece of evidence, the logs, the timestamps, the restricted access patterns, became part of an official file. APS called my son directly, asking questions in a measured, professional way. Their language was clinical, but heavy. They classified the situation as intentional neglect, the kind that required immediate intervention. Hearing the term from someone outside the house made the truth land harder. It wasn't just something I felt. It was something the system recognized. My daughter-in-law didn't explode, didn't shout, didn't try to make a scene. She stayed quiet and withdrawn, as if shrinking from the weight of what she'd set in motion. The utility accounts were taken out of her hands that same day. Access codes changed, controls restricted. The authority she had held so tightly slipped from her grasp without a single dramatic moment. It was removed the same way she had taken my comfort, quietly, piece by piece. My son walked around the house like he was carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. He didn't defend her, but he didn't confront her either. His silence wasn't loyalty. It was shock. He kept apologizing in fragments, never finishing the sentences, unable to look me in the eye for more than a few seconds at a time. I didn't ask him to choose sides. I didn't tell him what I felt. The facts had already done enough damage. That evening, APS arranged a temporary placement for me in a senior support apartment nearby. Not a facility, just a quiet, supervised complex for short stays during investigations. The officer drove me there himself, his presence calm and steady. I carried only the essentials: medication, documents, a few clothes, and the folder of evidence. Leaving the house didn't feel like escape. It felt like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't realized had been growing over me for weeks. The apartment was small but warm. The hot water worked without hesitation. The heater responded instantly. The silence in the room wasn't threatening. It was simply quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my breath settle, feeling the difference in a way that hit deeper than I expected. After living under someone else's control for so long, basic comfort felt like a kind of freedom I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. It took time for the truth to settle fully. I had spent months telling myself the cold water, the dim room, the missing reminders were inconveniences, mistakes, oversights, things that happened in busy households. But sitting alone in a safe space, the reality became clear. Someone in my own family had decided what I did and didn't deserve. Someone I should have been able to trust had taken comfort and turned it into leverage. The sadness that came with that truth wasn't sharp. It was steady, almost solemn. But beneath it was a quiet clarity, vindication without triumph, closure without celebration. I had been pushed into discomfort by the person closest to my daily care. And now, finally, there was nothing left for her to hide behind. The days in the senior support apartment settled into a quiet rhythm, one I shaped myself without needing permission or explanation. I woke when I wanted, boiled water without wondering if the kettle would be empty, and took long showers that stayed warm from start to finish. It was strange how quickly normal comfort felt like a luxury again. I folded my clothes, organized my medication, and rebuilt small routines that had slipped away without my noticing. Each simple action reminded me that independence wasn't about strength, it was about choice. And for the first time in months, every choice in this small room was mine. In the calm of that new space, I began to understand how much the little things had revealed. Cold water that came at the same hour, a room just a few degrees cooler than the rest of the house, a blanket that disappeared at night and returned days later. None of those moments felt dramatic at the time. They were quiet, almost forgettable on their own. But together, they formed a pattern of control that was easy to overlook if you trusted the person behind it. I had told myself it was age, recovery, or inconvenience. I hadn't wanted to believe someone would chip away at my comfort on purpose, not when I needed stability the most. I thought a lot about how seniors live with discomfort simply because we don't want to burden anyone. We brush off cold rooms, long waits, strange restrictions, because we don't want to seem demanding. But discomfort is its own warning sign. When routines shift without reason, when access to basic things becomes limited, when someone else controls pieces of your daily life, those moments deserve questions, not excuses. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's that silence only helps the person who benefits from it. Growing older doesn't make a man weak, but trusting the wrong person can make him vulnerable in ways he never expected. The danger wasn't in my age or my recovery. It was in assuming that everyone around me valued my comfort the way I did. I had spent years managing my own life, and it took only a few weeks in someone else's home for that control to slip quietly out of reach. Recognizing the truth didn't leave me bitter. It left me clearer, sharper, more aware of how easily dependence can hide the intentions of others. I found real peace knowing the maintenance officer had trusted his instinct enough to speak up. He hadn't tried to be a hero. He hadn't made a scene. He simply shared one honest sentence because something felt wrong. That plain, grounded concern cut through everything my eyes had missed. His honesty gave me back what I didn't even realize I was losing. My sense of safety, my ability to question what didn't make sense, my right to live without hidden restrictions. Each evening, I sat by the window and let the quiet settle around me. The world outside moved at a steady pace, and I felt myself matching it again. No anger, no lingering fight, just a calm understanding of what had happened and what I needed to protect going forward. In the end, the lesson was simple. Comfort isn't something to take for granted, and a man stays safest when he pays attention to the hands that reach too quietly for the controls of his life.